And the only thing worse than no documentation is incorrect documentation.
Hey, Brett Chittum with Lawrence Systems, and I'm here with
Jason Slagle from CNWR.
Hey, we're here to talk in business technicalities about having a culture of documentation. And I will tell you, this is another hot button for Jason, and I want to just let him roll with this right now.
No, I mean, it's just one of those things where it took a long time to get there, right? We kind of hit a tipping point, I think, probably in the last 12 to 18 months where, things have gotten a lot better. And, I think that talking about some of that journey with you, Brett, I think is actually a good idea for everybody.
What are some of the things that, you've seen? We were talking last night, and you talked a lot about your journey and how it's transpired. It was interesting conversation. I think I was driving down the road, and I was just I was engaged in that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's been like a number of year journey, right? It's we kind of started this whole path to MSP from more traditional consulting with mostly bigger enterprise clients. We decided we wanted some the recurring revenue that comes with the more managed stuff, so we started to make a transition. And for years I kind of took the approach of we'll deal with process when we get big enough to deal with process. And that in hindsight is 100% the wrong approach to take. And the reason I say that is we very quickly went from, having not enough for some of the guys to do. And I had them working on some internal stuff to on fire enough that now we don't have time, or we're trying to carve out time to build processes. And we very much should have spent the times when we were less busy doing it. And documentation is no different, right? Like we kind of started this thing, or a couple years ago, where we use IT Glue now for at least the next month until I'm finally transitioned to Hoodoo. We're almost done with that. We started documenting inside a IT Glue. Before that, we used Confluence. We used a wiki, and it did okay, right? Like it was great for standard operating procedures and documents, but it wasn't so great for like client documentation. We moved into IT Glue. We kind of used the gamification features to kind of kick it off, but it didn't really get good adoption, right? Like I offered, I think, like a $50 Amazon gift card to the employee that wrote the most documentation in a month. Most doesn't mean best. Right. So, we got a lot of like really, really poor quality documentation as a result. So, we spent some time. I wrote an SOP on writing SOPs. Right. So it's like, this is what it looks like. We kind of as a group went through and read, and this was earlier this year. We read Checklist Manifesto, right, which gave us a lot of. That's a really good book. If no one's seen it, no one's talked about it. I highly recommend it for everyone in our field. Talks about distilling things down to 2 different types of checklists, depending on whether you're familiar with it or not. And it uses the airline industry as a prime example of where this works very well. So kind of wrote an SOP about writing SOPs and went through and started documenting in earnest. The biggest thing that happened with that is at some point there was a tipping point. And people don't use the documentation platform if there's no expectation that they're going to get an answer to their question in it, right? So at some point, we kind of made the edict that if a document doesn't exist and you're doing something, you write a document for it. If there's an expectation, we're going to do it again. And I think at this point now, our internal document store, not even counting client stuff, our internal like SOP bucket, let me pull it up here and I'll look. I think it's got, we're sitting at 559 documents in it right now that cover probably 60 to 70% of the stuff that my tier 1 people do day to day. Plus, some internal, like we have SOPs and documents around how we handle agreement reconciliation and building agreements, the business side of the business too, and not just the technical side. And,
well, you talked about, you started out with the wiki, and, we talk a lot about where our position in business is compared to yours, and the difference in time and stuff, and where we're moving towards a lot of what you're doing as well. I mean, we're in the wiki now as doing our documentation, but we've had our woes in it. I mean, and when we had a client call recently, and there should have been some stuff in there that wasn't, that happens though. But I think when you're process oriented, and you make it a purpose to do it. I think that's the biggest thing. It's got to be purposeful, right?
Yeah, it does. I mean, in the end, I think a wiki can work fine. It just takes a little more
Mhm.
diligence. Using a custom built documentation platform, the biggest thing you get is I get a lot of automations, and in particular here, I am only talking about documents,
Mhm.
right? Like the reason that we like, and those documents they could live in a wiki just as easily as they live in IT Glue or they'll live in Hoodoo, right? As a matter of fact, and many times I think that the IT Glue and probably Hoodoo, they're not the best platform for some of that. So much so that our internal policies and procedures for CNWR are actually pulling out into a SharePoint site.
Okay.
But the other things you get with the documentation platform, like the configuration, the firewall monitoring, and stuff like that, especially if you layer on something like Lion Guard, it just makes it stickier, right? So if people
Right.
are in the documentation platform anyway to look up, like, okay, how is that firewall configured without logging into the firewall? What's the expiration date of that server, right? Like, tell me about the network interfaces. If they're in there getting that auto documented stuff that you can just keep in there via some sort of integration, then they're in the system and they're more likely to use it for the documentation piece anyway.
Well, I mean, let's face it. There's documentation that doesn't really need to be secure,
Yeah.
and then there's that documentation that needs to be secure.
Yep.
And I like how you talked about you're using SharePoint for kind of your SOP, your
Yep.
process orientation, and then your Hoodoo or your IT Glue
Yep.
for the
Yeah.
stuff that probably needs to stay a little more secure.
Yeah, I mean the SharePoint site's private, so it's only accessible, and we use groups, right? We have a number of SharePoint sites, and we're getting into them. We were using Confluence before, and it was the same thing. We would
Mhm.
lock down spaces based on who needed access. It was just without, again, it comes back to that bootstrapping problem, right? Without a critical grouping or critical mass of documentation, no one expects to find a document for the thing they're looking for. So they don't ever go look. And because no
Right.
one's ever in there looking, they don't, unless you mandate it, no one writes the documents either.
Yeah. And does it take how much extra time do you think it takes to actually document something?
It, I would say, I mean, it's very variable. I would say on average, probably an extra 20 to 30% on any given ticket
Mhm.
that's new to write the documentation. If we're doing projects, we definitely have documentation and project management time both built into the projects these days, just because otherwise they don't get done, right? Like
Right.
it's not, that's especially if we're maintaining things on an ongoing basis, or even if we're handing them off, handing the documentation off is a great
Mhm.
value add to the customer, and the customer is willing to pay for that, and in many cases they expect it. So
Right.
I'm not doing that for free, right? So we just start building that time into the quotes.
Well, we've done some work together with our structure cabling guys,
Yep.
and the documentation you've given us when we've done work for you is just incredible. Did you, another quick question though, how much time does it save if you've documented?
Yeah. So I'll go back to the specific example you gave me there, and we'll show it here in a second because I redacted it so I can actually show the document he's talking about there. It saves a good amount of time. It doesn't necessarily. The first time I did this sort of documentation, and to tell kind of the story of how I landed there, when I was new into the IT career, I worked at an ISP. We weren't making a ton of money, as I was essentially the equivalent of a help desk guy. I was tech support, doing some light Linux system administration, and wasn't making a ton of money. So I took some side gigs on, I can't even remember what it was. It's like the equivalent of Fiverr today. It was like some
Mhm.
email thing you signed up for. They put you in a database, and I ended up at like Best Buys installing routers or servers, or like at one point I ended up at like some Home Depot distribution center installing like a whole stack of routers. And in that process, I got good documentation on how to do it, and I got bad documentation on how to do it. And I was smart, like I had a network background, so I could usually figure it out. But when you don't have access to the equipment, if you can't log into it, and there's not good documentation, it's a
Right.
lot of trial and error, and I wasted a ton of time, right? These jobs were fixed fee in many cases, right? So it's like, we're going to pay you $150 to go do this thing, and if I could go knock it out in a half hour, man, I was making bank.
Right.
But if the documentation was poor and I spent 4 hours there, then like now this isn't nearly as great. So
Right.
the first time I decided we used a resource like that, which was actually through Field Nation at the time, and now we're using you for a lot of that stuff. I decided that I was going to provide the good documentation, and it took the first time I wrote it. It probably took me 3 hours to get through and just create the format and get through it all. Now we knock them out about an hour, but it saves your guys' time, and consequently it saves my guys' time too, because if your guys are stuck, they're on the phone with my guys. Right. And now we're tying up both resources. And so in the end, that hour, I over average, it saves at least that hour. And sometimes it can save even more.
That's incredible. You want to show that document?
Yeah, go ahead. They're wiring a site and they're installing some rack mount stuff, right? It's just, we have expectations here of this is where we want things. This is how we want things labeled. We usually have them pre-labeled. This is how the things are connected. We have some stacking cables, right? This is where the network drops, when to contact us to verify everything's fine, right? And then, the other big thing that we send with this, and this is, I actually think, the most important piece of this, is we send this master cable list. Right. And this master cable list shows each device, the source port, the destination, and the destination port. Right. So when you're plugging things up, we have these devices pre-configured. So everything's on the same VLAN, right? These are all Meraki devices in this case, but all the VLANs are pre-configured. And if you cable things up like that, we've tested it in the office and we know it all works. Right. So it just comes up and it just works then, and we don't have to troubleshoot it. It just generally works pretty well.
That's good, because if you're plugging things into the wrong place, it's not going to work, right? I think.
I mean, we run this network here, I think has 5 VLANs on it, right? So, if you plug into the wrong port, you're almost certainly not going to get on the right VLAN. And, we use things like VLANs on the switches just to handle the internet connectivity, right? Because we have redundant MXs. And if you start plugging workstations into the outside VLAN and then the internet access into the inside VLAN, sometimes that may work because overlay networks are a thing, but man, it's probably not what you actually want to do.
It's incredible how easily documentation can actually make the job go smoother, right? And then documentation on when a client calls in to your office and they need a support issue, you can look at what you've either done in the past, how you've gone and rectified the problem maybe they're having now, right?
Yep. Yeah, for sure. It's again, I would say 60-70% of our incoming calls are, from tier 1 are handled off documentation. And we'll probably make another push soon where I tell the guys, if the document doesn't exist, write it. I know Ray Orsini from OIT VoIP, he maintains 90% and actually has a field in his PSA for the document that they use to solve the problem. And if it doesn't exist, they're expected to write it, and they want 90% adherence to that, right? So that's a great metric and an easy way to do that.
Well, I mean, not to plug Ray at OIT VoIP, but I'm in agreement with you because we're also a client of theirs and sell that to our clients. I love it because you can actually go into the repository online and pull things out if a client's having an issue. It's incredible what they've done.
He has really good documentation.
Yeah. Documentation is important, right? I think we're at the 14-minute mark now. Any wrap-up thoughts from you?
One last thing I wanted to get in there is it's also important as you start to get more documents to create some sort of schedule to review them. Because speaking from experience, I spent the first, I'm 26 years into my IT career now. And for probably about the first 20 of them, I hated documentation. And the reason I hated documentation is I found it was often wrong. And the only thing worse than no documentation is incorrect documentation. And I have definitely caused outages following a document that was out of date. So as you start to go down this road, you need to develop a system to periodically review documents and make sure they're still up to date. If they're not relevant anymore, delete them or update them.
Revisions are very, very important.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, this is Business Technicalities. I hope anybody out there watching has gotten some good information from this. If you ever have questions, you can reach out on the channel, or you can reach out directly to Jason or myself or Tom. Anybody, we're all out there willing to help, because I think doing things like this creates a better community in the IT space, in the MSP space. Definitely.
I agree. Cool.
All
Thank
right.
you. I'll talk to you next week.
Absolutely.
See you later.